So there I was, the smell of diesel still hanging in the air after my 200-mile drive when a woman in a neon green tracksuit strutted onto my driveway. Her heels clicked like a metronome as she slapped a $500 fine on my windshield as if she were serving court papers. The reason? My U-Haul apparently ruined the visual harmony of Willowbrook Estates. My name's Marcus, and I hadn't even turned off the engine before the HOA president, Deardra Pickering, or Deardra, as some folks call her, showed up like a storm with a stack of citations thicker than a phone book. 14 violations, everything from mailbox height and lawn length to the inappropriate color of my doormat. I swear, if she'd found a bylaw for it, she would have fined me for breathing too loud. She reeked of cheap perfume and raw entitlement as she told me I had 48 hours to pay $2,100 or risk foreclosure. But here's what made me grin. Deardra had no idea she'd just picked a fight with the guy who collects her rent. Imagine that, she was threatening her own landlord without knowing it. What would you do if some HOA tyrant came after you before you'd even unpacked your toothbrush? Drop a comment, where are you tuning in from, and what's your worst HOA nightmare? Let me back up so you know how I got here. Just 3 months earlier, I was living in Phoenix, managing commercial properties for a real estate company. I'd been keeping their buildings profitable for 20 years, but one morning they decided my entire department was no longer needed. They gave me a cardboard box, an awkward HR speech, and a security escort to the parking lot. And right on cue, my ex-wife announced she was keeping the house and moving in with her yoga instructor boyfriend. His name? Moonbeam. No joke. He sells crystals at the farmer's market. So when I got a call from my great Aunt Millisent's lawyer, saying she'd left me her house in Colorado, it felt like a lifeline. Millicent was my grandmother's sister, a tiny powerhouse of a woman who could fix a transmission on Saturday and run a church bake sale on Sunday. After Uncle Frank was killed in Vietnam, she raised 3 kids by herself, worked double shifts at the diner, and somehow found time to feed every stray cat in a 5-block radius. She was as tough as they came but with a heart big enough for everyone. Here's something I learned in property management: always read the fine print, especially when it comes to homeowners associations. HOAs are basically miniature governments with all the power and none of the oversight. And legally, their board members carry fiduciary duties, meaning they can be held personally liable for shady financial dealings. Remember that. It's going to matter later. Her house sat on a corner lot in Willowbrook Estates, a 47-home subdivision that started middle class in 1979 but slowly morphed into something far fancier. Now it's the kind of neighborhood where people drive luxury cars but still fight over who pays for appetizers. Monthly HOA dues had somehow ballooned to $180, supposedly for landscaping, pool upkeep, and community standards enforcement, which sounded about as fun as it was ominous. Looking back, the warning signs were all there. Millicent's lawyer even mentioned she'd had disputes with the HOA, but I brushed it off. I figured it was just grandma's stuff. Maybe she planted peonies instead of pansies, or set up a garden gnome without filling out Form 27B. Harmless, right? Turns out, I was wrong. So there I am, August heat rising off the pavement and making the streets smell like melted rubber, when Deardra Pickering herself steps out of a spotless white BMW. Picture a suburban Terminator in designer sunglasses. She's the textbook definition of an HOA Karen, the kind who peaked as homecoming queen in the 80s and never stopped trying to reclaim that spotlight. Her athleisure outfit probably cost more than most folks' car payments, and dangling around her neck was a professional-grade camera like she was documenting war crimes instead of mailbox paint chips. She circled my truck with the precision of a predator, that camera clicking so fast it sounded like a Geiger counter in Chernobyl. Each shutter snap made my temples throb. Then came the stack of glossy violation slips, embossed letterhead, thick cardstock, and my name already printed in curly calligraphy. This wasn't off-the-cuff nitpicking. This was premeditated, bureaucratic warfare. Commercial vehicles are prohibited in residential areas, she announced like a judge handing down a sentence, pointing at the faded Phoenix Property Solutions decals still stuck on my F-150. Never mind that it was my personal truck and not a work vehicle. To her, that sticker turned me into an environmental hazard. She wasn't done. Unapproved landscaping modifications detected, she added, gesturing toward Aunt Millisent's rose bushes. Those climbers had been blooming since the Carter administration, vibrant pink, the pride of the block. But because no one had submitted Form 27B to the self-appointed Committee of Aesthetic Purity, they were suddenly contraband. Then came my favorite, mailbox exhibits paint degradation exceeding community standards. She really said, paint degradation, like she was diagnosing terminal illness. The thing had maybe 3 tiny chips you couldn't see unless you were hunting for imperfections with a magnifying glass. As she delivered her one-woman theater performance, I noticed movement behind curtains. Neighbors were peeking out like witnesses to a mob hit. Their faces weren't just curious, they looked scared. A woman across the street yanked her blinds shut the second Deardra glanced her way. A guy washing his car suddenly became obsessed with tire pressure. This wasn't simple compliance, these people acted like they were living under an authoritarian regime. And then came the kill shot. Deardra smoothed her papers, cocked her head, and said coldly, the previous owner also had compliance issues before her unfortunate passing. The way she lingered on unfortunate made my stomach drop. It sounded less like sympathy and more like she'd checked it off her to-do list. I kept my voice calm, asked to review the HOA covenants and financials. Her reaction was instant and defensive, like I'd asked to see her internet history and bank passwords. Suddenly, all of it was confidential and required board approval. But when I casually mentioned my 2 decades in property management, her sugary smile faltered. For just a second, the mask slipped and I saw the predator beneath. She promised appropriate enforcement measures, and stalked off, leaving me with $2,100 in bogus fines and the uneasy feeling I'd just been targeted for elimination. What she didn't know, what made me grin even then, was that I wasn't just some random homeowner. I wasn't just a manager of properties. I owned them. Including, as fate would have it, the very house she lived in. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter wedged in my door like a mob contract. Deardra had escalated overnight. This wasn't just another violation notice, it was full-blown psychological warfare. The letter demanded immediate payment of all fines, which had mysteriously ballooned from $2,100 to $2,875 overnight thanks to administrative processing and late penalties that apparently bred like rabbits while I slept. Attached were time-stamped photos of my home from every possible angle, documentation CSI would have envied, plus threats of a lien within 30 days. She'd CC'd the community management company, her lawyer, and half the board, just to crank up the pressure. Here's where she miscalculated. Deardra assumed I'd roll over like every other terrified resident. What she didn't realize was that 20 years in commercial property management teaches you one invaluable skill, how to read the fine print, the very thing everyone else ignores like software terms and conditions. So I did what any seasoned property guy would do. I drove straight to the county recorder's office. If you've never been there, imagine the DMV's less attractive cousin. Fluorescent lights that make everyone look half dead, the smell of dusty paper and stale coffee, and clerks who act like you personally caused their career misfortune. But the record's there. Public. Which meant Deardra's little fiefdom had to operate under actual law, not whatever rules she scrawled on cocktail napkins. And what I uncovered in those records. Juicier than reality TV. The original HOA covenants I found dated back to 1983, and let me tell you, they looked nothing like the monster Deardra was waving around. That first version was 12 pages long, just basic neighborly rules. Stuff like, keep your yard tidy, don't turn your house into a circus tent, and don't run a used car lot from your driveway. Simple, fair, common sense. But over the years, those 12 pages had mutated into a 47-page authoritarian manifesto. It dictated everything from what seasonal decorations were approved to which direction you could walk your dog. Reading it felt less like community guidelines and more like the handbook of a dictatorship. And here's the kicker, most HOA rule changes require actual homeowner votes. If those votes didn't happen, then those new laws were as enforceable as a grocery list. Even better, Aunt Millisent's property came with grandfathered rights for her landscaping. Those roses Deardra had the audacity to call non-compliant. They were specifically protected in the original agreement. Her violation notice carried about as much legal weight as toilet paper. But the real prize was buried in the financial records. As a property owner, I had the right to see them. And what I found made my property manager instincts kick into overdrive. The numbers didn't add up. Expenses were inflated beyond belief, like someone had learned accounting from horoscopes. The budget looked like it had been designed during a wine bender. That's when Glattis materialized. And I mean materialized, like she'd stepped straight out of a spy novel. 78 years old, retired librarian, lived across the street. She'd been quietly watching me, and apparently decided I looked trustworthy enough for the truth. She shuffled over one evening, folder in hand, and whispered, "You're asking questions about the HOA, aren't you? Good. Someone has to." The folder she handed me was thick enough to stop a bullet. Glattis had been documenting Deardra's reign of terror with the kind of obsessive precision only a librarian could manage. 2 years' worth of records. 12 families targeted. Every case followed the same pattern, crippling fines, impossible deadlines, and forced sales below market value. And the kicker? The listings from those forced sales somehow always ended up in the same real estate company's hands. Guess whose? 3 elderly residents had already been bulldozed out of their homes. Mrs. Olivia fined over a mailbox post that leaned 2 degrees off vertical. The Rodriguez kids cited for excessive outdoor toys, because their bikes were visible from the street. Mr. Patterson, a Korean War vet, mind you, was fined because his American flag was improperly proportioned to his flagpole. The picture was clear. This wasn't just petty enforcement. It was a racket. That afternoon, Deardra came back, but this time, she wasn't alone. With her was Chad, her boyfriend, a wannabe tough guy wearing a fake-looking security badge that I'm pretty sure he ordered from the same website that sells Halloween costumes. They demanded entry into my house to check for interior covenant violations. Interior. As if she thought she had the right to step inside and tell me how my couch should be arranged. I politely declined, throwing in references to the Fourth Amendment and basic property rights. Chad, not to be outdone, started snapping photos through my windows like some bargain bin private eye. That's when I decided to drop my first breadcrumb. "Funny thing," I said loud enough for neighbors to overhear. "The HOA budget shows $40,000 in landscaping expenses, but the contractor only got paid $15,000. Makes you wonder where the other 25 grand went." The silence was deafening. You could have heard a moth sneeze. Deardra's face cycled through shades of red and purple like a neon sign short-circuiting. Chad suddenly remembered he had something urgent to do elsewhere. They bolted back to the BMW, but not before Deardra hissed that there would be serious legal consequences for my harassment and intimidation. I just smiled and gave a friendly wave. Because the truth was, I was only getting started. Deardra didn't waste time. The very next morning, I was sipping coffee on the porch when a city code enforcement truck pulled up. Out stepped an inspector who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Clipboard in hand, he muttered, "Got a complaint about an abandoned commercial vehicle." He walked around my F-150, checked his boxes, and quickly realized there wasn't a thing wrong with it. "Sorry to bother you," he said, shaking his head. But before he left, he leaned closer and whispered, "Tip came in at 6 a.m. The caller knew your exact truck description and address. Not random." 2 hours later, the phone rang again. This time it was the state contractor licensing board. Someone had filed a complaint accusing me of running an unlicensed business out of my home. The investigator was polite but had to ask if Phoenix Property Solutions was still active. I explained that the decals on my truck were leftovers from my old job, and I wasn't running anything here. Case closed in 5 minutes. But the message couldn't have been clearer. Deardra was turning the screws. That night, at 2 a.m, I heard crunching footsteps on gravel. Living alone sharpens your senses, and these sounds definitely didn't belong. Peeking through the blinds, I caught a white BMW creeping past my house like a stalker mobile. By sunrise, my mailbox was vandalized with sloppy spray paint. Nothing obscene, just random squiggles meant to trigger another violation. And waiting on the porch. A fresh pile of dog waste, placed so deliberately it was practically gift-wrapped. What Deardra didn't realize was that I'd already installed security cameras the day before. Years in property management will teach you that paranoia is just self-preservation. Tenants lie about damage, and cameras keep you sane. The footage was gold, Deardra's BMW circling at 2:17 a.m., her license plate clear as daylight, with Chad bumbling around my property like a discount ninja. But while she was dabbling in amateur vandalism, I was digging deeper into the HOA's finances. And what I found made the landscaping scam look like child's play. The pool cleaning contract was my first clue. $800 a month for a pool barely 30 feet long, a pool that hadn't seen a proper swim in years. When I checked the water, it looked like a failed science experiment, green algae blooms, floating leaves, and a smell that suggested something had died in there around the Clinton era. I called around, actual professionals charged closer to $200 a month. But Elite Pool Services was billing quadruple. Why? Because Chad owned it. His pool cleaning credentials, YouTube videos and sheer optimism. Then came the landscaping contract. $3,000 a month to mow 47 tiny lawns and trim a handful of hedges. I'd managed shopping centers with smaller budgets. The supposed vendor? Mountain View Landscaping, owned by Deardra's 23-year-old nephew. His previous resume highlights: a short stint at GameStop and getting fired from a pizza delivery job. And then there were the legal fees, $15,000 a year for routine compliance enforcement. Most HOAs spend maybe $2. Apparently, enforcing mailbox paint standards required the kind of legal firepower usually reserved for corporate mergers. The deeper I went, the uglier it got. But I wasn't alone anymore. My quiet probing had started drawing allies. First was Bob, a Vietnam vet with hands like wrenches who showed up one evening with a cold beer and sharp observations about the neighborhood infrastructure. Then Sophia, a single mom and paralegal, knocked on my door offering legal research help. Even Pastor Williams stopped by, saying he'd had enough of Deardra after she tried citing the church for excessive parking during Sunday services. We weren't just isolated homeowners anymore. A resistance was forming. But Deardra wasn't about to back down. She filed a police report accusing me of threatening her and making menacing remarks about her finances. Officer Rodriguez was assigned the case, but one look at my security footage told him what he needed to know. Word of advice, he said quietly as he packed up. Document everything. This pattern usually gets worse before it gets better. Sure enough, Deardra demanded right then and there that Rodriguez arrest me for disturbing the peace and intimidating a public official. As if being HOA president qualified as government service. The officer's reply was measured but firm: "Ma'am, asking about HOA finances isn't a crime. Filing false police reports, however, is." As Rodriguez drove off and Deardra stomped back to her BMW, I realized something crucial. I wasn't just dealing with a petty tyrant anymore. This was desperation. And desperate people don't escalate this fast unless they're hiding something big. And tucked away in Aunt Millisent's attic, I was about to find exactly what that was. Deardra's desperation hit high gear when she suddenly called an emergency HOA board meeting. The notice was shoved into my mailbox just 24 hours beforehand, which already broke the bylaws that required a minimum of 72 hours. But when people are panicking, they don't read fine print, they just try to bulldoze their way through. The meeting wasn't held at the community center or some neutral spot. No, she staged it in her own living room, and walking inside felt like being hauled into the principal's office. The place smelled of vanilla candles, and the furniture was arranged like a courtroom, with Deardra parked behind a massive oak desk that screamed power. On the agenda, printed on her real estate company's letterhead, no less, was exactly one item: emergency foreclosure proceedings against 1247, Maple Street. My house. Only 3 of the 5 board members showed up. Without a quorum, they legally couldn't vote on anything more serious than whether to order glazed or powdered donuts. But Deardra didn't care. She launched into her performance like a runaway train with no brakes. And then, out of nowhere, salvation arrived in the form of Glattis. She appeared in the doorway like a battle-hardened librarian angel, voice sharp and steady as she declared, "Point of order. You cannot conduct official business without a quorum. This meeting is procedurally invalid." The transformation on Deardra's face was something to behold. That plastic suburban smile cracked wide open, revealing the tyrant underneath. She started screaming at Glattis, actually screaming, calling her a meddling old busybody, and threatening to fine her for disrupting official proceedings. In seconds, she went from queen of the cul-de-sac to a full-blown dictator having a meltdown. While she was busy unraveling, I was connecting dots of my own. Sophia, the paralegal who joined our cause, had been digging into business registrations, and her findings made my property manager instincts buzz. Mountain View Landscaping. Owned by Deardra's nephew, the same kid who couldn't hold down a pizza delivery job. Elite Pool Services. Belonged to Chad, whose entire pool maintenance experience came from watching YouTube tutorials. And the HOA's go-to law firm, Legal Solutions LLC. That was run by Deardra's old college roommate, specializing in what could generously be called creative interpretations of HOA law. Every single vendor the HOA used was either family or friends, all charging bloated rates that would make a 5-star resort blush. I'd seen this scam before in commercial real estate: funnel contracts to insiders, skim profits, and bury it all under layers of fake paperwork. But the biggest revelation came when I started mapping out the violation patterns. This wasn't random harassment, it was targeted. Deardra systematically went after elderly homeowners, single parents, and anyone too stretched thin to fight back. The Hendersons. Fined for owning a garden gnome that didn't meet regulation standards. Meanwhile, the McMansion 3 doors down had half a dozen actual violations that mysteriously never made it onto any inspection report. Our resistance meetings at Rosie's Diner grew bigger every week. What started as casual chats over coffee turned into a secret neighborhood assembly. 23 residents showed up to the latest one, each with their own horror story. Mrs. Patterson described being fined for excessive memorial decorations after putting a tiny flag on her late husband's grave marker. The Johnson kids were written up because their chalk drawings on the driveway lasted beyond the acceptable temporary duration. Apparently, sidewalk art was now a crime. Then Bob, our Vietnam vet turned community engineer, brought the hammer down. He'd quietly inspected the community's infrastructure and produced a report that read like a forensic nightmare. Thousands billed for road repairs that had never been done. Drainage projects that existed only on invoices. A security system that amounted to one broken camera pointed at a tree. The more evidence we gathered, the clearer it became: this wasn't just petty power tripping. This was organized theft. That's when Deardra truly went nuclear. She brought in a so-called private investigator, though I'm pretty sure he was cut from the same cloth as Chad's fake badge. Soon, the rumor mill lit up like a church potluck gone wrong. Word spread that my military discharge had been dishonorable. It wasn't. That I was gang-affiliated because I'd once lived in Phoenix. Apparently, every Arizona resident is automatically suspect in Deardra's world. And the most absurd of all, that I'd blackmailed my great-aunt into leaving me the house. Which, if you're keeping track, would mean I'd somehow extorted a dead woman before she died. The racial undertones weren't subtle, either. Deardra was playing on every suburban fear she could conjure, trying to paint me as an outside agitator bent on destroying their pristine community. She even created fake social media accounts to spread her nonsense. Because nothing screams, credible HOA president, like anonymous trolling on Facebook. But while she was busy spinning lies, I was building a mountain of evidence. Every notice, every confrontation, every shady transaction, I documented it all with the kind of obsessive detail that would make an FBI forensic accountant smile. Then came her boldest move yet, a certified letter demanding I pay $47,000 in special assessments. The charges? A new playground, an upgraded security system, and road repairs. None of which actually existed. Payment was due in 10 days or she'd slap a lien on my property. I read it twice. Then I laughed. Deardra had just handed me exactly the kind of overreach I was waiting for. The court-ordered financial records landed on my dining room table the following Thursday, spread out like evidence at a crime scene. My attorney had worked his legal magic, and suddenly all of Deardra's carefully guarded secrets were mine to sift through. What I uncovered made every fraud case I'd ever seen look like amateur hour. Over $300,000 had vanished from HOA accounts through a shell game so tangled it would have made Bernie Madoff proud. Fake emergency assessments for projects that never happened. Invoices for supplies that were never delivered. Checks written to contractors who, after a quick search, turned out to be Deardra's relatives with freshly minted business licenses. And then came the kicker, buried deep in the property title research. My attorney's office had dug into mineral rights documentation and found a detail that made my coffee taste like victory. Aunt Millisent's land sat on a small natural gas deposit. Nothing huge, but enough that Rocky Mountain Energy had been paying royalties for 3 years. Those royalties should have gone to the property owner, me. Instead, they were being funneled straight into the HOA's general fund, with Deardra as the sole signatory. $18,000 of my money, stolen without my knowledge. That single fact gave me the legal standing to demand a full forensic audit of every HOA transaction under her reign. And just when I thought I couldn't possibly get luckier, I found a small key tucked inside Aunt Millicent's old recipe box, right between instructions for apple pie and pot roast. It opened her safety deposit box downtown. Inside, 5 years of meticulous records that would have made a federal prosecutor weep with joy. There were audio recordings of Deardra bragging about creative accounting and working around silly financial rules. Forged homeowner signatures on amendments that were never actually voted on. Bank statements showing systematic theft disguised as legitimate expenses. But the most gut-punching discovery wasn't financial. It was a letter. In Millicent's careful handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before she passed, she'd written. Marcus, if you're reading this, Deardra Pickering has probably tried to destroy what's left of our community. I've gathered everything I could, but I'm too old and tired to fight anymore. Maybe you aren't. The evidence is here. Make them pay for what they've done to our neighbors. Suddenly, Aunt Millicent's heart attack didn't seem so random. Her doctor's records, which I'd subpoenaed during probate, showed dangerously high blood pressure that spiked exactly when Deardra's harassment campaign began. The stress had literally killed her. And I couldn't shake the thought that Deardra probably poured herself a glass of wine to celebrate the moment her biggest obstacle was gone. That was the shift for me. It stopped being about my mailbox, my truck, or my fines. This wasn't personal survival anymore. This was about honoring the memory of a woman who'd given everything for her community, and making sure her predator finally paid. The evidence was overwhelming. Mail fraud, wire fraud, embezzlement, crimes on a scale that would make the FBI perk up. Her real estate license violations were stacked in neat little piles, each one enough to end her career. By the time I added up inflated contracts, fake assessments, and stolen royalty payments, the theft topped $450,000. But here's the beautiful part, Deardra had no idea how much proof actually existed. She thought she was sparring with one nosy homeowner asking inconvenient questions. What she didn't know was that Aunt Millisent had already built an ironclad case against her, piece by piece, long before she died. And now, all of that was in my hands. The annual HOA meeting was coming up, and by law, it couldn't be cancelled once notice went out. For big votes, 67% of homeowners had to attend. That meant I needed at least 32 people in the room. My little, coffee shop coalition had commitments from 31 households already, and the list was still growing. Deardra's days were numbered, she just didn't know it yet. Aunt Millicent's dining room had transformed into something between a war room and an FBI field office. Her antique table was shoved against the wall, covered with bankers' boxes, binders, and a timeline that looked straight out of a conspiracy thriller, photos, documents, violation slips all connected with red string. Glattis, of course, had crowned herself my chief intelligence officer. She showed up with homemade cookies and decades of librarian organizational skills, sorting files like she was preparing for battle. Sophia, our paralegal powerhouse, had basically turned her home into a second law office. She color-coded everything, red for criminal violations, blue for civil damages, yellow for procedural screw-ups. Her system looked like a rainbow of justice. Building the team felt less like organizing neighbors and more like assembling the Avengers, if the Avengers specialized in HOA fraud instead of aliens. Jennifer Olivia, a bulldog attorney with 15 years of HOA law experience, signed on. Her reputation? Making corrupt board members cry during depositions. She brought along a forensic accountant who could trace stolen money through more shell companies than a Russian oligarch. We also had a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes, and a media consultant who'd once produced investigative TV segments before going freelance. Even the State Consumer Protection Office started sniffing around and offering pro bono support. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just another neighborhood squabble. This was something bigger. And the neighbors? They were rallying like it was a political campaign. I went door to door like I was running for mayor, explaining residents' rights and sharing proof of Deardra's shell game. Sophia set up a WhatsApp group that grew from 5 members to 37 in less than 2 weeks. Photos, documents, stories, everyone was finally talking. Pastor Williams offered his church basement for meetings, giving our cause moral weight Deardra couldn't touch. Bob used his engineering expertise to document every infrastructure lie she'd told, producing a report that read more like an indictment. The forensic accountant sliced through the HOA's finances with surgical precision. Every suspicious payment was traced, and the pattern was obvious. Fake invoices led to inflated payments, routed through family-owned shell companies, before landing in Deardra's personal accounts. The flowchart he built looked exactly like an organized crime syndicate, because that's what it was. Sophia prepared legal packets thick enough to choke a courthouse, cease and desist orders for harassment, injunctions to freeze HOA accounts, criminal referrals for multiple agencies, even a class action framework for wronged homeowners. She also drafted a petition to remove Deardra from the board, citing financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. Our media strategy came together thanks to Sarah Mitchell, a local newspaper reporter who specialized in corruption stories. She jumped on it like Christmas morning, and soon the Denver TV affiliate showed interest too, especially when they realized elderly residents had been bullied out of their homes. By the time we were done, our evidence package was 847 pages long, bank statements, audio recordings, video clips, sworn testimony. Judges love visuals, so we created before and after photos, promised projects versus what actually existed. A playground that was never built. Road repairs that never happened. Landscaping bills that looked like a drunk teenager with a lawnmower had cashed them. The contrast was devastating. To prepare for the big showdown, I even practiced my presentation with the local community theater group. If you can handle amateur actors nitpicking your delivery, you can handle an HOA crowd. They helped me anticipate Deardra's responses and craft counterarguments sharp enough to stick. Sophia compiled everything into a homeowner's handbook we called HOA Rights and Remedies. It explained financial transparency, how to challenge discriminatory enforcement, and the legal responsibilities of board members. People don't realize HOA boards carry fiduciary duties just like corporate directors, and that means personal liability when they steal. We booked the community center for the annual meeting, arranged professional recording equipment, and invited legal observers from the Attorney General's office. Media would be present too. Nothing makes crooks sweat like cameras rolling. The night before the meeting, I sat in Aunt Millisent's kitchen surrounded by towers of evidence, neighborhood support, and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my military days. Calm. Focused. Ready. Deardra had no idea what was coming. Deardra must have sensed the walls closing in, because her behavior went from petty to outright unhinged. The neighborhood gossip network, faster than any intelligence agency, let her know residents were organizing. And her response? She tried to shut it all down. First, she attempted to cancel the annual meeting altogether, citing security threats and outside agitators. The irony was rich, the woman who'd been terrorizing her neighbors for years suddenly claiming she felt unsafe. But Colorado law is crystal clear, once proper notice is sent, an HOA meeting cannot be cancelled just because democracy feels inconvenient. Next, she hired a private security company to intimidate residents. That plan collapsed when the security manager realized he was being asked to act as her personal goon squad in a suburban spat. Professional guards don't take kindly to being used as props in HOA drama. Then came the rumors. According to the Deardra Pickering Disinformation Network, I was planning to stage a violent takeover that would destroy property values and attract dangerous outsiders. She whispered to Mrs. Rodriguez that I was leading a gang conspiracy to seize the neighborhood. Apparently, the retired librarians, church volunteers, and Vietnam vets in our coalition were now a threat to national security. But here's the real reason she was panicking: money. The bank had already frozen $89,000 in HOA funds pending the Attorney General's investigation. With her cash pipeline cut off, she tried destroying records to cover her tracks, adding obstruction of justice to her growing rap sheet. She even attempted to bribe the forensic accountant with the promise of fat real estate commissions. He turned her down flat and reported the attempt, offering kickbacks to an expert witness in an active case. That's the kind of move that lands you in federal prison. Her personal attacks escalated too, crossing from smear campaigns into stalking territory. Fake online reviews popped up overnight, painting me as violent and unstable. She filed false reports with the DMV about my truck, claiming it had unsafe modifications. Chad started tailing me to job interviews, lurking in parking lots like a bargain bin spy. Imagine trying to restart your career with your HOA president's boyfriend creeping in the shadows. The low point came at the grocery store. Deardra followed me aisle to aisle, positioning herself at the end caps like she was running a surveillance op. When I finally confronted her, she claimed she was monitoring potential threats to community safety. The store manager wasn't impressed. He told her flat out that shadowing customers is called stalking, and she needed to leave. Meanwhile, coalition members were getting their own taste of her harassment. Glattis received a violation for excessive bird feeding activity, allegedly attracting undesirable wildlife. Sophia's kids' bicycles, stored neatly in her garage, were flagged as improper storage. Bob's military flag was cited for unauthorized display during non-federal holidays. It didn't stop at paper fines. Residents started receiving anonymous phone calls late at night, raspy voices warning them to mind your business. One morning, Glattis found her windshield cracked like a spiderweb. Sophia discovered wilted flowers on her doorstep with a note that read, "Mind your own business, or this could be you." Subtle as a sledgehammer. We filed police reports, and Officer Rodriguez added everything to what he called the Pickering file. Apparently, we weren't her first victims. But this time, she wasn't dealing with scared, isolated homeowners. She was dealing with an organized resistance. And while Deardra ramped up her suburban terrorist act, I documented every single stunt. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every bogus citation was photographed, time-stamped, and handed over to law enforcement. Her longtime lawyer, the college roommate who'd been enabling her shenanigans, suddenly dropped the case when she realized just how much criminal exposure was on the table. Deardra's new attorney tried to cut a quick plea deal, offering partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. I refused. This was no longer about money. It was about justice, for Aunt Millisent, for every elderly neighbor forced from their home, and for every family she'd terrorized. The community rallied harder than ever. Yard signs sprouted overnight, transparency in HOA management. Local businesses donated supplies, venues, even catering for our meetings. A retired cop offered his security expertise. For the first time in years, neighbors weren't hiding, they were standing together. And that's when Deardra's spiral reached full meltdown mode. Deardra's breaking point came when she realized criminal charges weren't just a possibility, they were inevitable. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had started sniffing around. The state attorney general's office was building a civil case. Even her new lawyer looked like he wanted to wash his hands of her. So, she tried what I can only describe as a sprint into crazy town. First, she attempted a getaway, fleeing to her sister's house in Montana as if crossing state lines could erase federal mail fraud charges. The plan fell apart spectacularly. Her credit cards had already been frozen by court order, and her BMW broke down outside Denver. Imagine the Queen of Willowbrook stranded on I-25, unable to afford a tow truck. That's not a crime thriller, that's comedy. When she slunk back into the neighborhood 2 days later, she looked like she'd been camping in her car. Neighbors watched from their windows like they were witnessing a failed fugitive stumble home after a botched escape. But she wasn't done embarrassing herself. One night around 11 p.m., she showed up at my door carrying a duffel bag stuffed with $50,000 in cash. She called it restitution for any inconvenience and actually said, "Let's put this unpleasantness behind us." She might as well have been auditioning for a mob movie. What she didn't know was that I was wired for the FBI. Agent Martinez suggested it after her failed escape attempt, and apparently my background in property management made me a natural for undercover work. The recording captured everything, 47 glorious minutes of Deardra admitting she'd borrowed HOA funds, created fake assessments, and gotten creative with the accounting. My favorite moment? When she said, "You understand how these communities work, right? The residents are sheep. They need someone to make decisions for them." I was providing a service. Somewhere in a federal office, I swear an agent snapped a pencil in half listening to that. The attempted bribery handed prosecutors another felony, but more importantly, it gave us a confession bulletproof enough to sink her case forever. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was uniting like never before. Out of 47 households, 41 were openly supporting our rebellion. The 6 holdouts. All family members or people financially tied to Deardra. We even started a community fund to help elderly residents with legal costs. Within weeks, it had grown to $12,000, built mostly on small donations. The symbolism was powerful, people were literally investing in their freedom. Local businesses pitched in too. The restaurant down the road donated catering for our meetings. The hardware store offered supplies to repair vandalized homes. Even the mailman joined the cause, reporting every suspicious package or late-night delivery attempt. Turns out, federal employees don't take kindly to mail tampering. And then came the tipping point, national attention. HOA abuse groups picked up our story online. Calls poured in from other communities across the country facing the same corruption. The hashtag Millicent Army started trending in property management circles. Not exactly Hollywood fame, but it felt good knowing Aunt Millicent's fight was inspiring people far beyond Willowbrook. Deardra's professional life collapsed like a house of cards in a storm. Her brokerage contract was terminated the moment her bribery attempt hit the news. The state licensing board suspended her pending investigation. Former clients crawled out of the woodwork with complaints about shady deals going back years. She filed for personal bankruptcy, trying to shield her assets, which only made investigators hungrier. The final twist of irony. Her own house went into foreclosure. The same woman who had spent years threatening her neighbors with foreclosure couldn't pay her own mortgage once her scam dried up. If that isn't poetic justice, I don't know what is. Her last-ditch strategy was pure desperation theater. She planned to paint me as an outside agitator, blame everything on the management company, and stuff the annual meeting with Chad and a few relatives posing as supporters. She even tried recruiting people from neighboring HOAs by warning them that outside interference could be coming for them next. But while she scrambled to fabricate loyalty, we were finalizing a presentation that would finish her off for good. The forensic accountant's report was crystal clear and devastating. Our attorney's legal brief identified 12 separate felonies. Bob's engineering analysis showed thousands wasted on phantom repairs. And our private investigator had caught ongoing financial crimes on video. The night before the meeting, I visited Aunt Millisent's grave. I told her about the coalition, the evidence, and the justice we were about to deliver. The evening was warm, fireflies dancing above her headstone, and I promised her that everything she'd fought for would not be in vain. Tomorrow, Deardra Pickering would face the reckoning my aunt had prepared for years. And this time, she wouldn't escape it. The morning of the annual meeting buzzed with the kind of electricity you feel before a thunderstorm. By 7 a.m., residents were already lining up outside the community center, folding chairs in hand, coffee thermoses steaming. The place smelled of fresh wax from last night's cleaning mixed with nervous anticipation. The room was built for maybe 50 people, but 73 packed inside. Local media crews set up cameras in the back as if they were covering a mayoral debate instead of an HOA showdown. Sarah Mitchell from the paper had her notebook ready, and a Denver TV crew adjusted their lights. HOA corruption was suddenly front-page material. Deardra made her entrance 20 minutes late, clearly going for theatrics. Flanked by Chad and 3 relatives who looked deeply uncomfortable, she strutted in wearing a navy blazer meant to scream authority and clutching a briefcase stuffed with more threats than actual law. Her first move was to seize control of the meeting, rattling off procedural authority and board prerogatives like a suburban dictator quoting from a monarchy handbook. She announced that the first order of business was removing me from the community for disruptive behavior and threatening safety. That's when Glattis stood. Straight-backed, voice booming like an avenging librarian, she called out, "Point of order. Under Colorado law and our own bylaws, this meeting must allow homeowner input before any business is conducted. You cannot remove residents without due process." The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of support. Deardra's face cycled through colors like a mood ring on overdrive. She tried banging a gavel, never mind she didn't actually have authority to use one, but the room had stopped listening. When my turn came, I stepped forward calm and steady, the confidence of knowing I had the truth on my side. I began by honoring Aunt Millisent, explaining how she had spent her last years gathering evidence to protect her neighbors. Then came the presentation. The forensic accountant's charts hit like artillery. Slide after slide showed systematic theft, $447,000 siphoned away. Before and after photos revealed promised improvements that never existed. Audio recordings captured Deardra herself calling residents sheep and bragging about creative accounting. The room gasped, shouted, even wept. Elderly residents who'd been harassed finally saw why. Parents who'd watched their kids targeted with chalk fines clenched fists in anger. And then came the fatal moment. Deardra leapt up, screaming about conspiracies, forged evidence, and plots to destroy the neighborhood. In her frenzy, she played the race card, sneering that neighbors couldn't trust his kind to understand traditional values. Silence fell. 3 seconds of heavy quiet. Then the room exploded, not in applause, but outrage. These were people who'd known me, shared cookouts, seen me walk my dog. They knew exactly what she was implying, and they rejected it outright. The knockout punch came when I played the recording of her bribery attempt. Her own voice, crystal clear, confessing to years of theft and manipulation. You understand, right? The residents are sheep. I was providing a service. Chad jumped up, trying to argue the tape was illegal. But Jennifer Olivia, our attorney, was ready. She cited Colorado's single-party consent law on the spot. Legal. Admissible. Game over. Deardra's face collapsed into the 5 stages of grief on fast forward. Detective Williams from the Financial Crimes Unit stepped out from the back of the room and announced formal charges were being prepared. The FBI was reviewing evidence for federal prosecution. The Attorney General was pursuing civil penalties. The vote was swift and merciless, unanimous removal of the entire board. Deardra and her cronies were replaced by interim leadership, with me appointed Financial Oversight Chair. Independent management hired. Criminal prosecution approved by acclamation. As TV cameras rolled, Deardra had her final meltdown, screaming about conspiracies, lawsuits, betrayal. Chad had to physically hold her back from lunging at people. And when it was finally my turn, I delivered the line I'd been holding for months. My great-aunt taught me that communities are built on trust, not fear. Today, we reclaim our community. The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. It wasn't just applause, it was release. Vindication for every bullied elder, every family fined into silence, every neighbor who'd been too afraid to speak. That day, justice came to Willowbrook Estates. And it tasted exactly like victory. The aftermath of that meeting rippled far beyond our cul-de-sac. Within 48 hours, Deardra was arrested on charges ranging from wire fraud to embezzlement. News crews captured her being led out of her once pristine house in handcuffs, her navy blazer traded for an orange jumpsuit. The headline on the Denver Post read, HOA president charged in $450,000 fraud scheme. Chad tried playing the loyal soldier, but investigators quickly discovered his fingerprints all over the pool contract scam. He folded within a week, cutting a deal to testify in exchange for reduced sentencing. Loyalty only lasts so long when prison time is on the line. The courts froze Deardra's assets, seizing her luxury SUV, brokerage accounts, and even the overpriced furniture she'd bought with stolen dues. Homeowners began filing individual suits, and the Attorney General announced a civil action to recover every cent of the stolen money. Meanwhile, Willowbrook Estates transformed almost overnight. For the first time in years, neighbors weren't hiding behind blinds, they were out in the streets, grilling, laughing, swapping stories. Kids chalked up sidewalks without fear of fines. Bob organized a volunteer crew to patch potholes the HOA had ignored for years. Sophia spearheaded a new transparency policy where every resident could view financial records online, no questions asked. At our first official community barbecue under the new leadership, Pastor Williams gave a speech that hit everyone right in the chest. For too long, we lived in fear. But fear only rules when good people stay silent. We found our voices. We found our strength. And we found each other. The applause that followed felt like cleansing rain after a drought. For me, it was personal. Standing on Aunt Millisent's porch that night, watching families gather where once there had only been tension, I finally understood the legacy she wanted me to protect. She hadn't left me just a house, she'd left me a mission. A reminder that dignity, fairness, and justice don't survive on their own. They have to be defended. Deardra eventually took a plea deal. 5 years in state prison, restitution payments, and a lifetime ban from holding any fiduciary role. Her name became a cautionary tale in HOA seminars across the state, the president who thought she could build an empire of fear and got dismantled by her own neighbors. As for me, I stayed. What began as a fight for survival became a calling. The neighbors asked me to keep serving as financial oversight chair, and I accepted. We built a new board, one that valued transparency over control, community over profit. Slowly, Willowbrook Estates became what it should have always been, a neighborhood, not a kingdom. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself flipping through Aunt Millicent's files. I don't need them anymore, but I keep them. They're a reminder of her courage, her meticulous care, and the quiet war she waged long before I arrived. She fought with pen and paper, documenting truth when no one else dared. All I did was carry it across the finish line. The roses she planted out front, those non-compliant ones Deardra hated so much, bloomed brighter than ever that spring. Neighbors stopped to admire them, and every time they did, I smiled. They weren't just flowers anymore. They were a symbol. Proof that beauty, dignity, and resilience always outlast fear. And every time I see them, I whisper the same words. We made them pay, Aunt Millicent. Just like you wanted.